Well, greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to, depending on wherever you may live or however you choose to read your clock, this early morning, middle of the night bonus. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button. It takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads that I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to this early morning or middle of the night bonus upload, shall we? Today's first encounter. Since it's starting to get colder in the upper Midwest, I decided that I would share some of my grandfather's stories he has told me about his time working as a forester in Michigan's Manistee National Forest. He never got a chance to write any of his experiences down, so I figured I'd share them here. For some background, my grandfather started working in the Manistee area in 1949 when he was 28 years old. Before then, he had been drifting around the region doing odd jobs in logging until he was hired by the Forest Service in the northwestern part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. The work, as I understand, was slow, and most days he and his crew were sent to different parts of the forest to address various tree and land concerns. My grandfather was always an avid outdoorsman, and he enjoyed hunting and fishing just about as much as anyone in this region. Sadly, he died in December of 1998, when I was still rather young, but I remember whenever we went to visit my grandfather, he would sit my brother and I down and share experiences about his days in the Forest Service. Working outside every day allowed him to witness all sorts of wildlife like black bear, whitetail, fox, bobcat back in those days. He even revealed his encounters with bears while he was deep in the forest, telling us that those moments were some of the most memorable of his life. Being up close to such beautiful and powerful animals, usually his tales were exciting, and the enthusiasm which he shared them with us inspired us to go to the backyard and look for animals between the pines. Although there wasn't much wildlife around Grandma and Grandpa's property, they still always kept a close eye on us and never let us wander too far from the house. Finally, a few years before he passed, my grandfather deemed my brother and I old enough to explain why. I was about 9, my brother 11, when grandfather first opened up about strange things he had experienced. All our childhood, we had heard him go on and on about his peace that he had in the wilderness, or used to bring him, but this time his tone was completely different. I don't remember all of the details, but I asked my brother to help piece together grandfather's story, and my dad as well. He too heard the experiences in question multiple times. It was the mid-50s. He never gave an exact year. October had rolled in behind a cool autumn breeze and the sound of Canadian geese flying southward. The first of his strange events had occurred at night. He was driving home from a local bar where he and his crew had spent the last few hours after work. It was a windy night, and the pines on either side of the road were blowing ferociously. No moon or stars could be seen through the thick cloud cover, so the only illumination of the road ahead came from the headlights. By his reckoning, he must have been going close to 50 miles an hour at that very moment, when something huge leapt across the road not 20 feet before him. His headlights had shown the animal's silhouette. It was dog-shaped and massive, almost stretching all the way across the road. It only made one bound to get to the other side, and its size alone was enough to unnerve my grandpa. At the time, he had assured that the animal was just a large wolf, except timber wolves hadn't been spotted in this region for decades. He considered it a bizarre encounter, but nothing came of it that night, and he was able to return home without anything else strange happening to him. The second of his events admittedly frightened me enough to avoid going outside at night for years. Even now I'm weary of noises in the dark because of the obvious fear in my grandfather's voice when he told us his second experience. Some details are provided by my dad. It occurred in the same month as his first encounter, a few weeks later. On a night that was pretty cold for the season, it maybe hit 40 degrees, but it was a calm night with very little wind. Grandpa's house at the time was very small, and it stood in a lot with about 6 other similar-sized homes. None of his neighbors tended to stay up very late, so it surprised him to be awakened by loud noises at about 1 in the morning. They sounded like scratching on sheet metal, with occasional thumps and bumps, like an animal was trying to get in. My grandfather apparently got up, fetching a flashlight to put on his boots, and went to the front door. In the front room, the walls of which considered a mosquito screen stretched between 2 wooden frames. Once in that front room, Grandpa could hear sounds more clearly, and they were coming from the nearest of the neighbor's home, maybe 50 yards to the right. It was incredibly dark out there, with no street lights to illuminate anywhere. The neighbor's house had a porch light on, but my grandfather couldn't make out what was creating the racket through the screen, so he slowly opened the front door to look out. He described to us in great detail the animal that he saw there, and he always said he would remember them exactly as they were, for fear brands memories the strongest. 3 massive dogs covered in long black fur were against his neighbor's home, scratching at the siding, making visible claw marks with each swipe. Each beast stood 7 feet tall, with their front legs stretched for another 2 or 3, easily reaching the roofing and the gutter of the home. Their scratching, however, didn't make it seem like they were trying to get into the house, as Grandpa explained. He thought that they were doing that to get whoever was inside out. The next part was actually the hardest to get out of my grandfather. It was strange that he was so eager to tell us everything thus far, despite how he felt about the subject, but he was rather hesitant, as I remembered, to divulge the last horrifying details of this encounter. He claims that the animals then noticed that he had emerged from his own home just across the lawn, for each one turned to look straight at him just 50 yards away. They had pointed ears like wolves and huge bodies that rivaled large black bears in size. They also supported themselves not on 4 legs, like any other native mammal, but instead they stood on 2, towering 7 feet above the ground. The sounds that they proceeded to make, my grandfather had said, would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was a shame that he could neither produce recordings nor accurately mimic the so unwolf-like screams the animals made, for the detail always fascinated me the most about this experience. They didn't sound like fox, coyote, or bobcat. Instead, they forced a half-scream, half-howl out of their jaws that Grandfather was sure held the teeth of a carnivore. Grandfather never told us exactly what happened next. I guess we assumed that he ran inside and locked the doors, and didn't look outside until the next morning. He would tell us that 4 of his neighbors, including an elderly couple that lived in the nearest house, didn't stick around very long. He did say that he had tried to talk to them about what had happened that night, but they remained evasive and never gave him any straight answers. That turned out to be somewhat ironic because grandfather himself kept tight-lipped about many of the details of his stories. He would always say that he heard those exact screams on 2 other occasions, both times while he was in the Manistee Forest, and he showed us an old Forest Service report detailing a possible timber wolf sighting in the area, complete with photographs of huge pawed prints in the mud. The thing is, grandfather never told anyone his stories but his most trusted friend and family, which is unique among Michigan Dogman witnesses. After the craze that Steve Cook's Legend song stirred in the 80s, it's no wonder that so many stories from the region surfaced. I had heard a few bits and pieces about the so-called monster before grandfather told his tale, but it wasn't until later in life that I realized his encounters had to have been with the same creatures. Whether I believe him that a massive wolves walk upright through the Michigan forests, I'm still not so sure, but as a modern zoological curiosity, the stories of strange beasts from a passionate woodsman who knew his wildlife certainly remain among the most remarkable I have ever heard, simply because of the genuine emotion in which he relayed his experiences. Legends like these might just be figments of our collective imagination, so all I can do is present what I've heard and let others judge for themselves what is real and what is pure fiction. Today's second encounter is one of my favorite encounters that I have shared once, maybe twice on this channel, but it is very remarkable, and for all those new subs, I decided to share it again. It was that time of year for our annual caribou hunt in 1989, when my hunting partner and I ventured into an area below the Kewetinock Ridge, alongside of the Kewetinock River in British Columbia. We were working the area between the river and Mounts Maripole and Carnarvon, with Hamilton Ridge to our south. It was a cool, crisp morning, and we were seeing some animals start to move, with none of them being to our liking, and the distance between us and the herd was far too great. Having seen the activity, we decided to foul in the direction of the herd in hopes of seeing a more substantial animal at some point. We had made our way all the way down to where the warden's cabin was located, on the southwest side of Hamilton Ridge, and were now at the point where we were sandwiched between Hamilton and Torture Ridge, respectively. At this point, my partner and I were sitting with our bodies facing opposite directions. I was combing Hamilton Ridge with my binoculars, my friend combing Kewetinock with his. We had to have been sitting there for over an hour observing the movements of a number of caribou, when my friend says to me, "I have never seen a timber wolf that big in my entire life. You've got to check this out." On cue, I turned and began to fix my binoculars on the area in which he was pointing. At this point, the two of us are now sitting, with our eyes fixed on what appeared to be a wolf that was the size of a bull elk, a fact of which in of itself is hard to digest. The distance was great, but based on the size of the larger caribou it was stalking, walking well below them, it was twice the size of the largest male, which did not make any sense. To me, what I was seeing was an impossibility in the natural world. A timber wolf at that size would have been in the neighborhood of 500 pounds, which just cannot be. As I was looking at it, I said to my friend, "It's got to be a bear." But even as I said it, I didn't believe the words that came out of my mouth. The coloration wasn't right for a bear, and yet the rump sat too high, with the spine to be the profile of a wolf. It was truly a puzzlement for the both of us. We sat watching this beast. It was obviously stalking the herd from a lower position on the ridge. It must have been 20 minutes later, as we both sat watching intently, that this beast lifted off the ground, with what we believed to be its front legs, which were now hanging from its body, and began to make its way up the hill toward the herd, appearing just as a hunter would be trying to hold his rifle, trying to get closer without being seen. This thing was now walking, hunched like a man. It made its way into position behind a bush where it once again squatted down and was evidently watching the activity above it, as so were we. The herd was lumbering along and had to have consisted over 50 animals or more, when suddenly, as we watched, this beast made a lightning-fast movement, closing the gap between itself and the herd, repositioning itself behind another grouping of brush just below them. A couple of the caribou seemed to be momentarily startled as they began to trot, but then all things settled down again. Moments later, the creature launched itself into an uphill and diagonal run, aiming toward the middle of the herd. And the animals began to run, but the creature, being much faster in our eyes, closed the gap quickly and launched its body, swatting a female to the ground with what appeared to be one blow from its now extended arm. Very much like a grizzly would whack down an animal on its back in chase. It was now on top of the caribou, thrashing at its body in a violent manner. With both of its now apparent arms, this creature, while straddling the caribou's body, had thrown so many blows in such a brief amount of time that it was inconceivable to our eyes how many had actually been thrown. This was followed by a long pause, where it just sat atop of its victim, apparently resting and eyeing its prize. Some 15 minutes later or so, this wolfman beast stood on its feet and hoisted the caribou, placing it over its shoulders like a woman wearing a mink stole, and began to walk down that slope, angled to the north. It was then that I said to my friend, "I want to see its face." I leveled my sight on the hill in front of it and pulled the trigger, firing a single shot, the sound of which bounced back and forth between the ridges, and it was loud. As soon as that blast occurred, this wolfman stopped in its tracks and looked directly at us. Immediately, my friend said, "Look at that sucker's head. It has a long snout and pointed ears. It's damn half human, half wolf." He was right. Its body was long and lanky, covered with what was gray fur or hair, and from our perspective, it had a long but tapered snout, just like a gray wolf, with what seemed to be a variety of coloration in its face. Its ears were protruding upward from the head like two small triangles, and there was no doubt about it. It stood there apparently unafraid of who we were or what we could potentially do to it for almost 2 minutes. The creature then began to trot away with what was very long strides across the face of that ridge at a speed which, quite simply, a man could not achieve. And all of this while shouldering what must have been a 200 to 300 pound animal on its back. In what was a matter of only a few minutes, this wolfman had covered about a half a mile and disappeared into the timber at the base of our north. My friend and I sat and compared notes about what we had seen. When we had seen it on the caribou straddling it, the back was lean and V-shaped, appearing to be very muscular. When the arms began to thrash at the fallen caribou, they were extremely long, and the movements were performed at a speed which seemed like a blur to our eyes. After having risen to its feet, it hoisted the body around its neck and shoulders like you or I would lift a 5-pound bag of potatoes, as if it was nothing. I think the craziest damn moment of all was when I saw it lift up from being on all fours to the 2, which was the defining moment of this sighting. This singular movement completely blew us out of the water. We both at that point knew that we were seeing something totally unique, and quite frankly, extraordinary, if not supernatural. And yet there it was, hunting and walking, attacking a flesh and blood animal for food. It was just so incredible. Today's third encounter. In 1981, my friends lived in a very rural cabin near Baxter State Park, Maine. The road was only traveled by its residents. You could drive on it and not see another car. I was driving there one night as I went around the last bend before reaching my friend's cabin. An 8-foot tall Sasquatch was standing on the side of the road. It was massive. It had to be 4 feet across, with the shoulders brownish blonde fur. I then noticed it was a male, its skin dark. The face had a long beard and looked both ape and human-like. He stood there motionless looking at me. I was freaked when my headlights were on him and we were actually making contact. It was not 20 feet from me. I sped past it into my friend's driveway, running into the cabin screaming that I had just seen a Bigfoot. Years later, I bought some small property on Mount Blue State Park, Maine. One winter, a friend was visiting from Utah. My boyfriend and his friends went out snowmobiling at night. Later, we're inside the cabin and started to hear these bizarre growls, like no noise I had ever heard before or since. The growls got louder and louder, and then whatever it was started screaming, literally shaking the cabin. It was right outside. I ran toward the door and placed a board barricade through the loop. As soon as I had done that, something was pulling and shaking the door from the other side. Each time we changed our position in the cabin, that part of the cabin would be attacked next. Terrified, my boyfriend had bought a pistol, so I grabbed it, climbing the ladder to the bedroom. Whatever that thing was, it landed on the roof above us. Its screams were the scariest thing I had ever heard, impossible to repeat. Just as we thought our lives were over, we could hear the snowmobiles coming back. Whatever that thing was, it ran off. We told the guys what had just happened, and they went out looking for tracks. At first, they thought we were crazy, until they saw huge unknown prints with long claw marks in the snow, deep scratches on the window frames and outside walls. My boyfriend was an experienced hunter and could not explain the prints or the claw marks. We soon moved west to California. There is no way I was staying in that cabin, let alone in Maine anymore. Today's fourth encounter. I have tucked this away and not shared this with anyone. We live in Southern California, east of LA. The incident occurred in 1996. My wife and I were leaving home early this morning. It was still dark. As we were trying to get on a major highway near our home, I hit something coming out of a residential construction area. It ran extremely fast in front of my car, and I had no time to stop hitting this thing. I came to a stop as soon as I could. I told my wife I was getting out to take a look at what I had just hit. She begged me not to get out. I was sure I had just hit a dog. I stepped out and round the car. The headlights of my car shone upon this thing that I had never seen before. It was disturbing. I backed up a little bit and realized what I had hit was not a dog. I have owned and trained large dogs most of my life, but nothing compared to the size of this thing. Nothing about it resembled what I would say was domesticated canine. Everything about it was wild and bulky. It had what looked like a lion's mane. It had teeth that looked like they came out of a Hollywood horror movie. I cannot even begin to describe the fright I had when seeing this thing. I backed up a bit more. I could see its teeth were unusually large and sharp, and there was a pool of blood forming underneath its mouth. Its eyes were open, but yet it was not moving. I could still see a bright amber color to its eyes. My wife stepped out of the car and asked, "What is that?" I said, "I don't know." We got back in and backed up and drove around it. I said, "If it's still there when we get back home, we'll take a closer look." Later that day, when we got back, it was gone. A dried pool of blood was only the evidence remaining. To this day, we have kept quiet about this incident. 26 years later, I now feel compelled to share, not because I feel guilty about the experience, but because I had another unexplained sighting. We live in the same home as we did the previous incident. One evening, I was a few blocks away from my house going through a house that I was getting ready to sell. I'm a realtor and own my own business. When I was finished, I exited the front door and walked to my car that was parked in the driveway and got in. As I backed onto the street, I observed a large upright creature cross behind me. I immediately stopped and looked out the passenger window. This creature was running on its hind legs, and between the house and the neighbor's property, I sat in the car dumbfounded at what I had just seen. Then I had a flashback of the incident in 1996. I quickly realized that this was either the same creature or something very similar. It was the last time I'd seen this creature, but now I realized that there is an unknown upright canine-like creature living in this area. Thinking back to the latest encounter, I estimated it was easily over 8 feet tall, and it had a very human-like gait while it ran. Tonight's fifth encounter. My experience took place last summer while on break from work during the slow part of the night. I live and work in Mitchell County in western North Carolina. I would take a short drive to a park near my work spot that was full of wildlife. I'd like to watch the wildlife, occasionally a raccoon or fox breaking a wood line. The park backs up to a rather large creek. The area is devoid of artificial light as the darkness of the woods does not spook me or make me jumpy. I was raised in the mountains, and I enjoy the solitude. On this night, there was no normal night sounds, such as crickets or frogs. I also found it strange that all the wildlife seemed to be gone. This bothered me a bit. I decided to leave some dog food at the edge of the wood line, hoping to entice a particular family of raccoons out, so I could at least see that they were okay. I didn't see a gray fox that would hang out in the area. This fox would come within a few feet of me, meander around, and then retreat back into the woods. After walking near the woods from the food, I heard a deep growl come from inside the edge of the wood line. I had never heard an animal growl with such intensity and so deep. I could literally feel that vibration from that growl hit me in my face and inside of my chest. I knew that it wasn't a bear, whose sounds I was familiar with. I dumped the food on the ground with one hard drop, hoping that whatever was in the wood line would take off. I backed away with my head down until I reached my truck. My instincts told me to drive away, and so I did. I decided to go back about an hour later. I was now curious as to what this creature was. I parked in the same place, and this time walked to the back of my truck to grab a smoke. While standing there, I observed a dark mass come across the road and disappear into the overgrowth in an open field with blackberry brush. I do have sharp eyes, and I was able to discern some detail. I can only describe this creature as some kind of hybrid canine. It was on all fours, but it did not appear natural. It moved very quickly in fluent motions. The gait was weird as well. Like the front legs were pulling its body forward, it almost had a human-like movement to it, as if it could stand on its hind legs if need be. The long back was hunched. The snout was long, but it fit its body. What struck me the most was its ears, which were large and folded back. The legs also had muscle mass to them. My background working with dogs told me that this was something very unusual. I just knew the minute I saw it that it was very strange. It was there 1 second and gone the next. When daylight came, I drove back to that same location and looked for tracks and listened to my gut, and did not enter that wood line. For several months I did not tell anyone about it. I started searching the internet for what I had seen. I wondered if some type of hybrid had escaped somewhere. I found several online sites, but nothing came close to what I had seen. Then I came across a picture of a Dogman. If you take what I saw and stand it upright instead of being on all fours, that is what I saw with no doubt. It wasn't overly massive, possibly a juvenile. I spoke to some coworkers. Of course, they told me it was a bear or a large domesticated dog, but a few of them did acknowledge that the wildlife in this area had been disappearing for a while. I didn't speak about it much because of ridicule, but I do know what I heard, and how my instincts reacted to all of it. And there you have it, folks. I do hope you all enjoyed this middle of the night or early morning bonus as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you all for supporting this channel. After all, it is your support that keeps this channel growing and going, and what gives us all a place and a chance to share our experiences and theories judgment-free. Everyone is treated with the respect that we all deserve, and that is because of all of you, so thank you. Stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real. They are out there and dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless you all.